Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Murphy from the Politics in the Pub Committee. So welcome to another interesting night with a topic that's getting more and more dramatic. It's the TPP in trouble in the United States. Can it be blocked in Australia? First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person here especially. We have two great speakers tonight who have really been involved in this campaign in a deep way. First of all, Dr. Patricia Ranald, who you've seen before here. She's the Research Associate at the University of Sydney. Her doctoral thesis was in International Relations at the University of New South Wales, and it was a comparative study of the World Trade Organisation and regional trade agreements. She was formerly a Senior Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales and has also worked for trade unions and community organisations. She recently published widely on the social impacts of globalisation and trade agreements, including the TPP, and she's the convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, which is a network of 60 community organisations and many more individuals. It advocates for fair trade policies based on human rights, labour rights and environmental sustainability. The second speaker this evening is Michael Waits. He's a lead organiser and educator with the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association. Having worked for over 10 years as both a registered nurse and registered midwife, Michael became an organiser for the association in 2005. He's also the Oceania Sub-Regional Secretary for the Public Services International, which is the global trade union. Public Services International, among other things, engages in the fight against free trade agreements and their negative impact on our communities. It's through the Nurses and Midwives Association's affiliation to PSI that Michael was tasked with engaging members of the association in the fight against the TPP and other trade and investment agreements. Dr. Patricia Ranald. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and thanks for coming out on this cold night, 2 nights before the election. I'm sure a lot of you have been doing pre-polling and other valiant things. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to their elders past and present. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Most of you may be, or some of you may be familiar with AFTINET, but the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, or AFTINET, is a network of over 60 community organisations, unions and many more individuals, which monitors trade agreements and advocates for fair trade based on human rights, labour rights and environmental sustainability. We're not against trade, but we want trade agreements to be fair and to result in better lives for people, which their proponents claim they do, but we know there's a different story there. So I'm going to talk mainly about where the TPP is up to, both here and in the US, and give a sort of overview of it and the overview of the debates around it and how they've been influenced by recent developments. So the TPP between Australia, the US and 10 other Pacific Rim countries was secretly negotiated over the last 6 years. The final text was only released in November last year, and before that the only information we had about it was from leaks on the internet. And the text was only released after all those governments had agreed what the text should be. So the text is actually not changeable, really, from that moment on. Now, the parliamentary process, which comes at the end, is not so much that parliaments vote on the whole agreement or whether they agree with the whole agreement, but they only vote on the implementing legislation, and that is the laws that need to be passed to implement immediate changes. But there's a lot in this agreement which binds governments into the future and actually prevents them from doing certain things in the future. So, for instance, I'm going to talk about the right of international corporations, global corporations, to be able to sue governments over future laws and policies. That's in this agreement, but there's no implementing legislation because it's just in the text. So Parliament doesn't get to say, no, you can't have that in the agreement. They can only vote for and against the implementing legislation. So it's a very secretive and undemocratic process, and last year we were actually instrumental in getting a Senate inquiry into that whole process, which released a report which they called Blind Agreement, which recommended a whole lot of changes to the process, including release of negotiating texts and release of the final text before it was agreed and signed by governments, and that Parliament should vote on the whole agreement, not on the implementing legislation. So there's still, it's still a very secretive and undemocratic process at the moment, because the current government, of course, hasn't taken up those recommendations. Now, no government has yet passed the implementing legislation, and the terms of the agreement say that Japan and the US, which are the two largest economies, plus at least 4 other governments, have to pass the implementing legislation, otherwise it won't go ahead. So there is still a chance that it may not go ahead if we can have campaigns in those countries, particularly in the US. But it also matters what we do in Australia in terms of whether the agreement will go ahead. So, as I said, no government has yet passed the legislation, and it actually seems least likely in the United States, and I'll come back to this later. But I think most of you know that both the major candidates for president are now opposed to it, or at least Hillary's saying she's going to renegotiate it, and there's also still not a majority in the US Congress that supports it, because they haven't put it to the US Congress yet because there's not yet a majority. And it's not going to be voted on until after the US election in November. Now, this is an even stronger argument that the Australian Parliament shouldn't rush into passing the implementing legislation, because we'd look pretty foolish if we passed it and then the US didn't. So in Australia, the process is that it's being reviewed by parliamentary committees, or a parliamentary committee at the moment. And this process has been interrupted by the election, but after the election, the committee will hold public hearings in different cities, and it will then make a report, and Parliament will have to vote on the implementing legislation. Now, we may also be able to get a Senate inquiry, which would prolong the process, and I'll explain that a bit later. But basically, we need to mobilise around that process. And I'll talk more about that when I come to the end, but we need to have the kind of demonstrations at the parliamentary hearings that we had for the China FTA parliamentary hearings last year, where thousands of people need to get onto the streets. But basically the story is that after the election, the campaign will continue, and there is still a chance to foil the process in Australia and in the US. So why have we been campaigning against the TPP for the last 6 years? Well, basically, as I said, it's a secretive and undemocratic agreement which has been driven by the United States on behalf of its most powerful global corporations. The big pharmaceutical companies, Hollywood with its media exports, IT companies, big tobacco has had a big finger in the TPP, global services companies and other global companies. So it's not really about free trade. Only about 4 of the 30 chapters are actually about trade issues like reducing tariffs. The rest of them are about trying to restrain governments from actually regulating global corporations in various ways. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to pick out the worst ones just to remind you what it's about. So it's not about free trade, it is about extending the monopoly powers of corporations. So Firstly, the TPP gives special rights to global corporations to bypass national courts and sue governments in unfair international tribunals on the grounds that a change in our domestic law or policy has somehow harmed their investments or their future profits. Now, these tribunals have no independent judiciary in the way that we understand our national courts, no precedents and no appeals. So the tribunals can be made up of people who are representing corporations one month and then sitting on a tribunal the next month. And they have a record of very inconsistent decisions, and decisions which tend to favour the complainants, and only the companies, the international investors, can use these tribunals. Governments can't sue the companies, only companies can sue governments. So it's a very biased system. And it's so bad that John Howard didn't agree to it in the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement in 2004. It's the only US free trade agreement where there's no provision for this ability to sue, which is known as investor-state disputes, or ISDS. So just some examples of how companies have used this against things like health and environmental legislation. The Philip Morris company tried to sue our government for billions of dollars over plain packaging legislation. Who's heard of this case? Everyone? Most people? Yeah. Now, Philip Morris was a US company, so it couldn't use the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It shifted some assets to Hong Kong, said, hey presto, we're a Hong Kong company and we're using this obscure Hong Kong investment agreement to sue you. In the end, in December last year, after 5 years and $50 million in legal costs, they finally lost the case on the grounds that they were not a Hong Kong company. But it took the tribunal 5 years to decide what was plainly obvious to everyone. And it cost our government $50 million. The US Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company is suing the Canadian government for hundreds of millions of dollars because it refused a patent on a medicine which was not more medically effective than another medicine. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable decision, but the Eli Lilly company is challenging it. The Lone Pine Mining Company is suing the Canadian government over environmental regulation of gas mining. Now, that's something that really resonates here. The Quebec provincial government decided to have an environmental review of gas mining, and they were sued by this US company. All of these are under the North American Free Trade Agreement. But the French Veolia company, which operates here in Australia, is also suing the Egyptian government over contract dispute, and they're claiming compensation for a rise in the minimum wage. So when a global company can sue a government because there's been a rise in the minimum wage, there's something really wrong with this picture. So that's the first really big grab for corporate power in the TPP, but there's a lot of other specific ones. So if we look at pharmaceutical companies, the TPP locks in existing monopolies on medicines and also gives stronger monopoly rights to pharmaceuticals on the newest and most costly life-saving biologic drugs used to treat cancer and other serious illnesses. Now, these drugs are the ones that cost thousands of dollars for a course of treatment, and we only get access to them because they're subsidised through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. They already have 20 years of monopolies on new drugs, but they want an effectively, in the wording of the TPP, they effectively get an extra 3 years of monopoly. Now, through something called data protection. Now, our government is claiming that we won't have to change our law and nothing will change. But actually what they've signed up to is to do this extra 3 years through administrative means, not by changing the law. So it's a very sneaky way of doing it. But basically it also, especially for the developing countries in the TPP, for some of them it's going to be extremely costly because they don't already have some of the provisions that we have on patents. So thirdly, it also locks in copyright monopolies. And some of you might have seen that there's been a recent review of Australia's intellectual property laws, both patents on medicines and copyright, Copyright means that authors are entitled to be paid for a certain number of years after their works are published, but most copyright is now held by international corporations. Now, the TPP locks in stronger monopoly copyright, and also introduces criminal penalties for some areas of copyright, particularly on the internet, and particularly to do with things like trade secrets, which were not liable for criminal penalties before. So this is another example of extension of monopoly rights for international corporations. Fourthly, am I up to 4? Yes. It increases the number of temporary workers from 6 TPP countries who can come to Australia, and removes labour market testing to check if local workers are available. Now, we've just had the examples in the last few weeks of those workers who've been brought to Australia under the streamlined so-called provisions of the China Free Trade Agreement, and those workers were brought into Australia not speaking English, with no health and safety education, and were paid less than the minimum wage. And there's been several studies which have shown that this kind of treatment is very widespread under temporary visa provisions. And what this government is doing is expanding the numbers of those workers who are so vulnerable to exploitation without any protection really for their rights. The TPP also locks in restrictions on government policy to support local employment through government purchasing. Now, the whole debate about the submarines being built in Australia or South Australia, the whole debate about the future of the steel industry has now magnified this issue, because what trade agreements, including the TPP, do is restrict the extent to which governments can say we will buy local steel, or we will have local products produced in Australia for particular industries in order to support those industries or support industry development. So this has now become an election issue, particularly because the unions and Nick Xenophon have raised it, in South Australia in particular. And I'm pleased to report that in New South Wales, the unions here have succeeded in getting the Labor Party opposition in the New South Wales government to support a bill initiated by the Greens, which will put up that the New South Wales government should actually have local purchasing policies to support local industries. But these trade agreements tend to restrict that kind of activity by future governments. So I think I'm up to number 6. Despite promises, the TPP doesn't have effective and enforceable labour rights and environmental standards. Although the government says to us, well, there's a chapter about labour and there's a chapter about the environment. If you actually read those chapters, they say nice things, but they are not enforceable in the same ways as the rest of the agreement. I'll just give you one example about labour rights: child and slave labour. Now, you'd think that in a trade agreement that claimed to protect labour rights, they would at least ban the products of child and slave labour. That clause mentions child and slave labour, and it says we encourage governments to put an end to child and slave labour. Not ban the products, but we encourage governments to do something about it, and there's no enforceability of that clause. It's just wishful thinking. And of course, the TPP does include countries where there's child and slave labour, and there's child and slave labour in Australia, although it's not as visible as it might be. And finally, what are we supposed to get from the TPP? If it was a trade agreement, you might expect that we would get some benefits from it. Well, the economic studies, even by the World Bank, show that the TPP will have little or no economic benefits for Australia. So the number is like a statistical blip. After 15 years, it's 0.1% increase in national income or GDP, which is like this equivalent to a statistical error. So now, what's been happening in the US? I'll start with the Brexit. I think the Brexit has shown, apart from the really nasty racism and other elements in the campaign, it has shown, and a lot of commentators have said this, that a lot of people did a protest vote against the EU because they feel that it's part of a process of secretive and undemocratic trade agreements, and also a protest against inequality. What have they got from the EU in those working class areas of the north of England that have been deindustrialised? And there's been a lot of commentary about that, including here. But in the US, the latest developments are that Hillary Clinton has said that she's going to oppose the TPP both before and after the election in November. Yeah, whether we believe her or not is interesting, but she's been forced into that position by the Bernie Sanders campaign, who's had a consistent position against trade agreements for years and years, since NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the whole debate in the US has changed. Again, if you look at the editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, they're now starting to say, maybe there's something wrong with these trade agreements. Maybe there's a reason why, the majority of people in the US are opposed to them, and both presidential candidates are now opposed to them. So it's very clear that the majority of Democrat Congress members and senators are opposed to it, and that the Obama administration doesn't have the numbers to pass it yet because they haven't even put it up to the Congress. Now, they are going to make a last-ditch attempt to pass it in what's called the lame duck session of Congress. Now, what this means is that it's the session between November and December where the old Congress sits before the new Congress comes into office in January. So it's the old Congress, but it's after the election. Now, there's going to be huge pressure exerted on both Democrats and Republicans to support the implementing legislation in this period. Our contacts in sister organisations in the US saying that there's still a fair chance. It's going to be close, but they think that it can still be defeated. And they won't put it up unless they're sure that they've got the numbers. It is going to be a hard context for the supporters of the TPP, because there will have just been a presidential election where both major candidates are against the TPP. But on the other hand, there will be senators and Congress people who are leaving the Congress and have nothing to lose. The ones who've been re-elected might be a bit scared about voting, but our friends have done the numbers and they're saying they're confident that there's still a chance it can be defeated. And Bernie Sanders is keeping up the pressure. He wrote an editorial in the New York Times yesterday, and he's also been moving to firm up the opposition to the TPP in the Democrats' platform. Some of you might have seen those reports. And there's another platform committee meeting in about a week's time, and they're having a mass campaign for Democrats to write in and say, at the moment it says generally we don't support the TPP, but it doesn't say we will vote against it in the lame duck session. And he's trying to get them to make a specific statement saying that. So if it's not passed in the lame duck session, it's not likely to be passed in the new Congress anytime soon, because Hillary Clinton has stood on a platform of saying she'll renegotiate it. And that's going to take a long time because there's 12 countries involved. It's not like renegotiating NAFTA or a bilateral agreement. And most of the countries, including Japan, which is the second largest economy, have said, we're just not up for renegotiation. That's it. So what can we do about it? After the election, as I said, there'll be a parliamentary inquiry, there'll be public hearings, and there'll be implementing legislation coming up, no matter which way the election goes here. So we need to tell, particularly the ALP, the Greens and Independents, to take a stand against the TPP before the election and vote against it afterwards. Now, the big problem here is the ALP. The TPP does contradict ALP policy on all the points that I've mentioned, but it's always a fight to get the ALP to actually vote against a trade agreement when it comes to the implementing legislation. The Greens and the Independents, who are likely to be re-elected, that's Xenophon, Lambie and Lazarus, are firmly against it. So if the ALP decides to oppose it, and if, well, let's look at the different scenarios. If the coalition's elected, it's unlikely that they'll have a majority in the Senate. So if ALP, Greens and Independents vote against the TPP, there's a chance of stopping the TPP implementation legislation in the Senate. If the ALP wins, then, or if there's a hung parliament, but particularly if the ALP does gain a majority in the end, we'll be campaigning to pressure them not to proceed with the implementing legislation. And in the case, in either scenario, we would be pushing, well, particularly if it's a coalition government and they don't have a majority in the Senate, we'd also push for a Senate inquiry, which would delay the whole process as well. After the election, whoever wins, we will be reinvigorating our campaign with information addressing the new situation to put pressure on MPs. We will be trying to mobilise opposition and rallies and so on around the parliamentary inquiry process and public hearings. We'll be directly lobbying MPs and holding forums in Parliament. We can still stop the TPP, and please go to our website on Monday and find out what we're doing in that new context. And we've got leaflets here with our website, aftinet.org.au, and you can also join AFTINET if you want to give us more support through our website, or I've got a couple of membership forms here. Thank you very much.